Dust hovered low over the cracked ground. Birds scattered without warning. A high-pitched hum tore through the treetops. 2 black scorch marks burned deep into the soil. An armored truck lay flipped. No survivors. The bodies wore no uniform. Strange faces, eyes open. They were not from here. Later we learned they had crossed in from the southern border. We knew who had sent them. Ibrahim Traoré did not hesitate. He gave the order. Burkina Faso had long been dismissed on foreign maps. It was a blur of dry land and broken roads. A dead zone on the edge of the Sahel. Too poor to matter. Too unstable to win. For years the country had been carved by fear. Militants moved like shadows. Villages burned in silence. Checkpoints fell without a fight. Teachers fled. Markets vanished. And the world kept watching. But inside the silence, something moved. A 36-year-old soldier named Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. He held no grand title when he began. No medals. No foreign advisors. Only resolve. He did not wait for permission. He did not send letters to Paris or New York. He gathered men. Some wore uniforms. Some wore scars. They came from the barracks, the farmlands, the refugee camps. They brought rifles, machetes, binoculars, and maps. Many had lost family. All had lost patience. For 6 weeks they trained under the dust. No press. No parades. No promises. They moved at night. They mapped routes. They memorized sounds. Studied wind patterns. Watched for tire tracks and drone signals. Every tree became a marker. Every ridge a signal post. They called it preparation. Traoré called it survival. The plan was clear. A force of over 1,000 militants was moving through the north, armed with weapons from outside, funded by men who never set foot on Burkina Faso soil. They believed the country too broken to resist. They had not met Traoré. He did not match them in numbers. But he built something else. A formation of elite Cobra units trained to move in silence. VDP fighters from burned villages, sworn to protect what remained. A net of intelligence from market sellers, herders, and teachers. A code that traveled by foot, whispered between trees. It was not just a military plan. It was a reckoning. They named it Tempi Du. In the local tongue, it meant firestorm. They were not just rebels. They were not wandering fighters or desperate men with rifles. They were organized, named, trained, funded. They moved in columns. They carried communication kits. Some had night vision. Some had encrypted radios. They were backed by money that came from far outside Burkina Faso. The world called them terrorists. Locals called them death. They answered to no flag. But they followed orders. And those orders did not come from the villages they burned. Intelligence later traced satellite images, intercepted calls, and funding flows. The men moving through the northern corridor were not a rogue cell. They were a proxy force. A hired hand of someone else's war. They believed Burkina Faso was broken. They believed the army would stay behind checkpoints and guard empty roads. They had no idea someone was tracking them every mile. For 23 days, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. He watched. His men followed the convoys from a distance. They used binoculars, mirrors, dirt sketches. They tracked supply trucks and fuel stops. They marked when the fighters rested, how long they waited to rotate drivers, and when the satellite signals peaked. The rebels thought they were ghosts. But in reality, they were in a cage. And the door was closing. Traoré used no drones in the early days. He relied on people. Nomadic herders who saw tire tracks at dawn. Schoolboys who watched from rooftops. Mothers who whispered movements near water wells. Every detail became a point on a map. And the map became a trap. The corridor they chose ran through a narrow stretch of land, flanked by 2 ridges and dense brush. To them, it looked like cover. To Traoré, it was a funnel. He knew their pace. He knew their rations. He even knew their backup plan. But he waited. It was not about one ambush. It was about ending a pattern. The pattern of outsiders treating Burkina Faso like a proving ground. A place to test chaos. A place to feed war. The rebel convoy was made up of over 1,000 men. Some wore captured uniforms. Some drove trucks with fake humanitarian markings. Their mission was to cut through the north, seize territory, and destabilize the region. But they made a mistake. They grew too confident. They moved slower. They stopped longer. They sent fewer scouts. They thought the silence meant fear. But it was calculation. Traoré's forces were not idle. They spent those 23 days preparing. Ground sensors. Digging light trenches. Camouflaging sniper nests. They stockpiled ammunition in buried crates. They tested routes for evacuation and medical extraction. They used old maps, but their thinking was new. This was not a defense. It was a hunt. The moment the convoy crossed the final checkpoint, the timing began. From that second, every unit knew what to do. Every commander knew which group to target. Every sniper had a sector. Every scout had a code word. It was not a random clash. It was a controlled burn. And the men walking into it had no idea they were already inside the fire. The conflict was not just military. It was symbolic. It challenged the idea that African nations must wait for foreign help, that their victories must be supervised. Traoré rejected that. He built his own playbook. The militants believed they had the edge. They had newer rifles. They had funding routes from hidden accounts in foreign banks. They had handlers who promised air support if needed. But they lacked one thing. They did not understand the land they walked on. They saw trees and dirt. Traoré saw hiding spots and wind shifts. They saw empty villages. At 4:17 in the morning, the signal was sent. No trumpet. No speech. Just a coded word passed through static. 3 strike teams began to move. From the east, Cobra units in full gear advanced through the trees. Their boots crushed dry leaves. Their rifles were steady. From the west, VDP fighters moved in silence. Some without radios. They followed hand signals and instinct. From the south, a third wave moved in staggered lines, using ravines and goat paths. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of precision. Overhead, the first UAV appeared at 4:23. It circled twice before locking onto the target cluster. Coordinates were relayed in real time. Artillery units already hidden in the hills adjusted for wind. At 4:29, the first impact hit. A column of fire split the convoy center. Trucks flipped. Ammunition cooked off. Panic rippled across the enemy lines. Some tried to scatter. Others fired blindly into the brush. But the forest did not return fire. Not yet. The Cobra units waited for the second blast. At 4:32, the second artillery wave dropped. It struck the rear flank. Now they were surrounded. That was the cue. From all directions, the ambush closed in. Cobra teams emerged with sharp bursts of fire. They did not yell. They moved between rocks, firing in threes. Every shot had been drilled 100 times. No wasted motion. No calls for backup. The VDP fighters moved with fury. They knew this ground. They slid under broken branches. Used ditches as cover. Some carried old rifles. Some had machetes strapped to their backs. One group threw homemade grenades into a supply truck. On the far ridge, snipers had already taken position the night before. They worked in pairs. One watched the wind. The other squeezed the trigger. The kill zone was precise. The enemy tried to regroup. But the line was cut. Their command tent had burned in the first blast. Their radio truck was flipped and on fire. By 5 o'clock, they were split into 3 broken clusters. Each group tried to retreat in a different direction. But the routes had been mapped. Traoré's men had placed tripwires, spike traps, and decoy markers. Every escape path led to another crossfire. Villagers from nearby zones had joined in. Some were teenagers. Some were fathers whose homes had been taken. They moved in from the north, blocking the river trail. They carried old bolt-action rifles. Rusted but loaded. Some had only hunting knives and the will to fight. They were not trained soldiers. But they had waited years for this day. The sound of gunfire echoed for hours. Short bursts. Long eruptions. Then silence. Then another round. By 9:20, the last resistance faded. A group of 20 fighters tried to surrender. The order was clear. Capture for intel, not revenge. They were tied, blindfolded, and placed in the center of the clearing. Medics moved in next. Burkina Faso had lost men too. 3 Cobra soldiers. 12 VDP fighters. 1 local scout. They were carried out with care. By 10 o'clock, it was done. The field was still smoking. Shell casings littered the dirt. Broken boots. Spent magazines. Torn fabric. Final count, 1,200 enemy dead. No foreign soldiers. No military contractors. Not a single Western advisor on the ground. The weapons used came from Burkina Faso storage bunkers. The uniforms were stitched by local factories. The plan was drafted in a schoolhouse north of the capital. The intel came from farmers, mechanics, and old men sitting by the roadside. No news crew was there. No drone footage was broadcast on world channels. But in the villages nearby, people knew. By noon, drumming started in Cetina. By evening, walls in Barcelogo had been painted with the face of Traoré. In Caen, a woman cooked for 30 men and said her, "Son, the fighting was over, but the echo traveled fast." In the village of Cetina, the first drum beats started before noon. Old wooden drums pulled from storage huts pounded slow and deep. It was not music, it was signal. People came out of their homes, some barefoot, some in silence. No one had told them what happened, but they knew. In Barcelo, children ran to the brick walls behind the school with charcoal and chalk. They drew the face they had seen only in whispers, a strong jaw, sharp eyes, a red beret. Some wrote the word protector. Others simply wrote captain. The air smelled of dust and burned wood. But that day, the smell did not mean fear, it meant survival. In Caen, a woman carried a pot of rice and placed it beside a wooden grave. She sat on the ground, wiped her face with the edge of her scarf, and spoke to the dirt. "He kept his promise," she said. It was her husband's grave. He had died 2 days earlier, a VDP volunteer who had fought near the southern line. He left behind 2 children and a name whispered with pride. His family would never starve. The village had already started collecting grain and water for them. Across Burkina Faso, no official statement was made. No government press conference. No military parade. The army did not announce the victory. They had no need. The people already knew. In the capital, radios buzzed with questions: who ordered the strike, how many soldiers were used, was foreign help involved? But the answer came in one sentence, broadcast just after noon on the national channel: Ibrahim Traoré gives no speech. He gives orders. And the order was simple. Secure the northern line for 60 days. No exceptions. No crossings. Any threat, remove it. Soldiers did not return to base. They rotated in groups, staying in the field, checking trails, watching for movement. They shared meals with villagers. They helped rebuild fences and repair radios. In some areas, they stayed in old schools, turning classrooms into barracks. The region did not go silent, it breathed again. For the first time in years, children played without scanning the sky. Markets reopened. Wells that had been poisoned were cleaned and guarded. Some farmers returned to their fields. They planted not for survival, but for the season ahead. Not everything was healed. The dead were buried. The wounded wrapped in linen. Fathers did not come home. Brothers were not seen again. But even grief had changed. It was no longer shaped by helplessness, it was shaped by purpose. In Jibwa, an elder stood at a gathering and said, "Our sons did not die for war. They died so the war would not return." No one clapped. No one had to. In the Presidential Command Center, Traoré stood over a table covered in field reports. His uniform was dusted. His voice low. His mind already moving forward. A map of the Sahel region was marked in red and green, red for known crossings, green for routes secured. He asked for no applause. He accepted no interviews. When asked about what came next, he pointed to the eastern border and said, "They will try again." Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is not a flag, a speech, or a borrowed anthem. It is action. It is blood in the dirt. It is a village that refuses to run. Burkina Faso did not wait for a United Nations statement. No permission was asked. No aid was required. They looked at their wounded land and said, "We will defend this ourselves." And they did. Ibrahim Traoré did not just lead a battle, he exposed a truth long buried beneath foreign reports and diplomatic silence. A poor nation, if united, can resist. And more can win. This was not about borders alone. It was about the right to exist without begging. The right to protect one's children without approval from a foreign capital. In the dust of the Sahel, a lesson was written in fire. And across Africa, others are reading it now. Traoré is not asking to be followed. He is proving what is possible when a people stop waiting.